Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Viva Macedonian Matters. This is our second attempt and our first official podcast. I'm Zhivan Rendev from wet and windy Springvale, Melbourne, Australia, and my friend and colleague, comrade Branov. How are you, Mark?
How you doing there, Zhiv?
Very well, mate. What is it really snowing there? Is it still snow on the ground?
Today it started to melt, but yesterday was a bit of a surprise. I mean, it was like a winter day on April 1st, and yeah, I mean, it's now the sun's out and it's looking a little bit more like spring.
Well, the first I heard that they were going to legalize marijuana in Australia on the 1st, but I think it's turned out to be another one of those jokes. However, back to Macedonian matters.
Mm-hmm.
This is our first official one, Mark, and as we spoke, I think we should speak a little bit about the history of Macedonia since independence.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't start at independence because we have to preface it, I believe, with the backdrop of the breakup of Yugoslavia, because of a lot of the factors that were involved in the breakup of Yugoslavia are still there, and they're still probably the dominant forces, the dynamics in the Balkans. So can we go back to that euphoric day in September?
I don't know if it's too much off track, but just in case we've got people who are beginners to modern Macedonian history, maybe I should just very, very briefly touch on some of the things that happened a little earlier on, that I still think are relevant to what's happening.
Sure.
I mean, back in 1903, there was the first insurgency from Macedonians to liberate themselves and create an independent state called Ilinden. Then in 1912 and 1913, we have the Balkan Wars, where the remnants of Ottoman Turkey were fought over and then divided by Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece. Then this leads to World War II and the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Macedonia within the Yugoslav Federation, and a period of 50-odd years within Yugoslavia. When we talk about independence, what we're really talking about is independence from Yugoslavia, which is true. I think that what has kind of become more questionable is independence in a more general sense. Sometimes there's a lot of debate in Macedonia about sovereignty, independence in principle, and some of the European federalist types and Europhiles and other types of political strains will argue against Macedonian independence by looking at the last 30 years and pointing out all of the problems that have taken place and saying kind of like, see what happens, if you try to go on your own. And what I've always been struck by was how false that was. It seems to me that Macedonian independence from Yugoslavia was independent in name only, and there's actually quite a lot of dependence that's going on for any small state, and it's probably worth keeping that in mind when we talk about it.
Yeah, well,
certainly. Go ahead.
Continue, Mark. Sorry.
I was just going to say, certainly, even some of the great minds and observers in political science didn't really see what was coming in the late 80s and early 90s with the Berlin Wall. A lot of the pundits that you rely upon in your local newspaper and TV channel were not expecting that to happen, but it did. I think that there may have been some sense among neighboring countries, such as Greece, for example, that something was up, because, as we recall, in 1988, which was about 3 years before the independence vote, we had Greece start to suddenly change its tune towards Macedonia. As long as the Socialist Republic of Macedonia was within the Yugoslav Federation, Athens and Belgrade had a cozy relationship. They could rely on the Serbs to kind of keep the Macedonian question under wraps. And I
Well,
think what happened.
I think the Greeks understood because the Soviet Union had already imploded on itself, and I think the Greeks are much smarter politicians and more connected than what ours were in Yugoslavia and today. And they understood the gravity of the fall of the Soviet Union and the impact it would have throughout all the Eastern ex-socialist republics. So
It would seem so.
There's no difference. They did that. We underestimate the Greeks. We call them this and that. But really, we should have a little bit more respect for their canyon and nous and their connections in the Western world, because they certainly are in the inner circle of the second tier, I would say. They're always there.
Yeah, and for decades, the situation in Greece was such that they had a 50% share of historical Macedonia. They have a large restive Macedonian community to today who are not recognized and whose rights are still denied, including their language. So Greece has always had this Macedonian problem, so to speak. I think what happened in 1988 was kind of interesting because up until then, there was an official discouragement of the use of the M word in Greece. And then there was a bit of a change of strategy in 1988, kind of looking north and seeing that independence, or at least the breakup of Yugoslavia away, which suggested that cozy relationship between Athens and Belgrade was at risk.
And they probably saw it as an opportunity, Mark, not just a breakup, but as an opportunity to maybe further extend their influence in Macedonia, not just via Belgrade, but as they have done now with the Prespa agreement. They have not given up their plans for a greater Greece. It's just modified a little bit,
Right, but it's internal. The internal issues within Greece have had a big effect on the republic in a number of ways. So that certainly is true for independence as well. One of the ways in which Euro-Atlantic politics are imposed upon small nations is this kind of technique of selling you the rope itself, right? So there isn't a emphasis on showing up with a battalion of tanks and taking over. I think that's considered old school. I think what they want to do is they want to create a scenario where they can infiltrate a country and basically make it dance to their tune. So go ahead.
If we look at the history of the United States in Latin America, you are describing exactly how they ruled Latin America. It was through local despots, local favorites, who supported their interests in those countries. Nothing has changed. And in our conversations we've mentioned that it's not just Macedonia whose independence is questionable, but you could question some of the other countries of Europe, even large countries like Germany, Spain and so on. They are also, in the eyes of many of their inhabitants, occupied territories occupied by the same empire as us. We're just a little bit smaller and maybe not as significant and easier to brush off. We're not Italy. However, I think the basic relationship is between emperor and colonized, and we have joined the club. I think with independence, Mark, we went from socialist Yugoslavia to I don't know, to nowhere really, just to a little thorn in the side of the Greeks and the Bulgarians, and the sooner they can take us over, they feel the better. That's the plan that I see.
And unlike in other divided countries, you'll have situations like North and South Korea, let's say, where one side was clearly associated with China or Russia, the other side with the U.S. I think that in Macedonia, there's this added issue of the fact that Tito was part of the non-aligned movement. So it was actually three different states where most of the territory of Macedonia was located, with the northern part, which is now the Republic, being in this non-aligned movement, and then the Pedian Macedonia being more closer to the Warsaw Pact back in those days, and then Egeiska Macedonia being part of the kind of West. So yeah, NATO. So I think that's an added wrinkle. 1991 was a really special time. It was something that Macedonians remember very fondly, after many years of having no country on the map named Macedonia. Suddenly we had one. So I think I remember it as a time of great joy, but there was also quite a bit of concern, which happened almost immediately, and I think that was 100% because of the reaction of Greece to its Macedonia's newfound existence as an independent state, which was to create an illegal trade embargo at the port of Salonika. So the very first moment when this new political entity is born, it's slapped with an illegal trade embargo from a EU, NATO, Western-oriented country.
Our new best friend. May I add?
Yeah,
May I add our new best friend?
Yeah. This is kind of like the baby being born and getting that first slap on the ass to kind of
wake up.
Say hello, and it was. I mean, I don't know how you remember it, Zhivan. Maybe you can talk about it, but I recall it as being touch and go for a while. Like I don't think there was a lot of certainty about whether the state would get very far.
Well, like you said, initially it was joy, but it was joy tinged with a sense of foreboding, because both my father and I are aware of what neighborhood we live in, and we know what forces were arrayed against us. So we cried tears of joy and tears of foreboding because we weren't sure what would happen. And as you said, the first thing that has happened was economic warfare, trying to squeeze us out of existence, and that's how it's got to be seen. People call they call them embargoes and all that, but when someone's bullying you with an embargo, it's a form of silent warfare and can be every bit as destructive. As we saw in Iraq, it can kill hundreds of thousands of children, and as we saw in Macedonia, it probably also facilitated the corruption process and the transfer of wealth from the state to the various individuals, as happened everywhere else. But
I would just add that in the context of economic, there was a kind of economic warfare going on in 1992 against Rump Yugoslavia, which was the #1 trading partner of the Republic of Macedonia. So on one hand, you had an embargo from the south, which was the main port for Macedonian goods and things like oil. Then all of the northern border was also sealed by American troops because of the idea that Milosevic would invade, and that invasion essentially never came. But it did create a huge economic impact on this fledgling country, which was for quite a long time kept out of the United Nations and was essentially unrecognized. I remember it was in a very odd situation of having Western troops being sent as blue helmets in order to defend this northern border of a country that countries that are donating didn't recognize, right? So it's quite a weird kind of conundrum, and that extended for quite a while under the president Gligorov of the time and other characters in the original Sobrania. There was a long period of several years where that situation of limbo just sort of existed. One at a time, they were eventually going to start with different kinds of recognition from different states, but a lot of the key states in the region weren't recognizing it. So that process, I mean, at the risk of speeding through it too quickly, that process eventually culminated in 1995 with the first of a great many international agreements, and I word agreements in quotation marks perhaps, which are the means or the tools in which Macedonia's future has been guided by Western forces. So the first major one was probably the interim agreement in 1995, a kind of a curious name, you know, for an agreement that lasted for so long. And the interim agreement was the first of many agreements that were looked upon as by Macedonians as capitulations. You know, where you had a team of inexperienced Macedonian negotiators who were under various forms of influence, whether that was pressure, whether that was something a little bit more sinister. I'll let other people speculate.
I'm happy to call it. I'm sure there would have been intimidation. That's how they work. And
certainly intimidation could have been part of it, but I think sometimes there was less stick and there was more carrot as well. But I think that what happened was you had the first of many agreements where Macedonian interests were capitulated. You have on one hand a Greek state which was holding up Macedonia's entry into the United Nations based on completely ridiculous fears of invasion from the north, which made absolutely no sense. Even Antonio Samaras would later go on national Greek TV and affirm that was never true, right? And on one side, you just have to take a look at the concessions. In the interim agreement, the Greek state agreed to drop its illegal embargo. And I just like to know in what alternative universe that's considered a concession. I mean, if the embargo is illegal, then dropping it shouldn't be considered a concession. It sort of undermines the word concession, right? And then on the Macedonian side, there were all kinds of concessions, as you recall. So some of those involved accepting a name negotiation process, accepting a temporary reference, which was FYROM, F-Y-R-O-M, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. So this was the Greek attempt to kind of really emphasize the Yugoslav part. So referring to this former country in the interim reference, and then also very significantly, I believe, the changing of the Macedonian flag. I think that was another key concession among others. So a list of concessions from Macedonia, practically nothing from the Greek side except a promise to stop breaking the law.
That's in essence.
So
haven't they also always been those kind of agreements, or always
well, yeah, I mean,
we've just turned
do you
up
want to call it
and
an
told
agreement?
us sign on the dotted line and shut up and move out.
Yeah, or face possible destruction. That's the intimidation factor.
Well,
and so
yes.
Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was going to say, you asked in what kind of world agreements like that made? Well, in post-1984 Europe, bro, that's where those agreements are made. And I think a lot of people don't realize that the land of the free and the brave and the Western democracies, it might have been not as corrupt once, and that's debatable, but certainly at this point in time, it's run like a gentleman's club with 4 or 5 influences, 5 eyes. Even though they're not all part of NATO, they are very important in NATO. They seem to be the dominant force, helped along with their allies or the occupied allies. But if we can get back to, that first government of Gligorov's, it was under a lot of pressure.
Yes.
And they were very inexperienced, as you put it. Do you think that they had an alternative, a credible alternative? I mean, should they have looked east a little bit? Should they have had another suitor, another quarter? Or, I mean, you know, in Australia, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. So if you're compliant and if you don't complain at all, no one really gives a damn about you in the world. They'll do whatever they want with you. It's only when you have a spine and stand up for yourself. Now that's one thing that our people haven't done.
Yeah, and earlier on you mentioned how the Greek diplomatic corps is not given the respect that it may otherwise deserve, not in terms of its morality, but in terms of its skill. And one of the things that Greece has always done is leveraged its strategic position in the Mediterranean against its historical ties to Russia. So I don't know that there was much of an appetite for that at the time. But what happened from the early on periods all the way through modern Macedonian history was as President Ivanov would later put it, a no plan B approach, right? So this no plan B approach was meant as a way to kind of show Western powers Macedonia's willingness to do what it takes to enter those clubs and to become a member of this so-called family. I think that what Macedonians sort of learned was that kind of approach was quite naive, right? Because what happened was, they did eventually start getting an invitation to have a so-called seat at the table, but they didn't get a seat at the table. They were on the menu, and I think the reason is because of that no plan B. Now it's easy for me to say, with retrospect, but I do think that this approach was the source of a number of problems. I think that the interim accord, if we look at it, objectively, is full of so much nonsense that it could have been argued on its grounds that it wasn't an acceptable on the surface. I mean, if you take a look at the issue with the flag, for example, what exactly is the issue with the flag? Well, the issue with the flag is, according to Athens, is that it sports a symbol, the son of Kutlesh, which is emblematic of the ancient kingdom of Macedon, but is also a symbol that's found in all of Macedonian territories and in every part of pre.
All that was excuses. That was for the rest of the world. The Greeks don't believe that. They are not as dumb as what we think, but they played their cards better than us, and I think they played their cards better than us also because there is a very strong anti-American movement in Greece, and there has been.
There always has been.
And they have assassinated Greek ambassadors. So they've been able to assassinate Greek ambassadors and still be a friend and ally, whereas we've offered them whatever they've asked for, and we're still a beggar at the table, if I could put it like that. And
yeah. So when Greece is, go ahead.
And that was the problem, that we didn't have Plan B because we didn't have an opposition to Plan A. Everybody was on board. I think they were all disillusioned from the social experience and thought, geez, we made the wrong, without realizing that in 45 they had no choice. If it wasn't pro-Eastern or pro-communist, they had no choice. They would have been part of a greater Serbia or whatever. So, that was not their fault. But when we became independent, not to realize that you cannot put all your eggs in the one basket. You cannot trust imperialists who you've been against all that time. Like all the SDS members, they until a couple of years ago, they were still pushing the anti-NATO line, while at the same time accepting whatever NATO and the European Union was offering them at the interim agreement, at the Ohrid Accord. So I don't know where we go from here, Mark. You know, like, what can we do now?
Well, I mean, I think we need to just touch on the interim accord and why, you know, for example, a country like Greece, 10 times Macedonia's size, a NATO member, much larger army, you know why it would, you know, use this this trope that it was being threatened by the Republic of Macedonia. Well, the reason that has to do with what that symbol talks about. That symbol speaks to where Macedonian people live and territories where Macedonian people are indigenous. So this big issue that never even made it onto the table, you know, at no time did the Republic of Macedonia ever talk about the Aegean question, about the Macedonians who live in Aegean Macedonia, but the Macedonians who come from there. Yeah, it was the golden bullet that they never used. Yep. And they were somehow convinced. You know, we can speculate as to how we're somehow convinced that it was wiser to you know, to sidestep that sensitive issue that Greece really doesn't want to talk about, still doesn't want to talk about, right? And it was actually the whole point. I mean, if you didn't have an Aegean community, if you didn't have an Aegean question, if you didn't have an issue of the debts of Begeltsi and the people who lost their property and the amount of historical denial, the lack of human rights in northern Greece, then the flag wouldn't have been an issue either, right? It would have been an inert symbol, but it's very much not such a symbol because it threatens the national Greek myth. So that's why that symbol had to be removed and replaced with a new flag. So I think that's very relevant. You know, we skip over it at our peril, right? And then the other issue is you have this interim you know, temporary reference in order to get them into the United Nations, which was, I think, the main goal. And not only did they have to accept that indignity in their minds, but they also sign on to a long and protracted name negotiation process, which lasted decades, right? Which in and of itself, you know, at least signals the idea that you're willing to change your name as well.
Which they have.
So why would they do that? You know, why would they do that? You know, I mean, I think the more beneficent interpretation is that they were under some kind of extreme pressure, and you know, they didn't have any other choice. The more skeptical, you know, interpretation would be more along the lines of, you know, there was something in it for them. I think that either way, the damage was done, right, in the sense that you are actively negotiating your name, so you're sending signals to countries like Australia, for example, which never recognized the Republic of Macedonia under that name. You know, based on the idea that, you know, it was a matter of dispute, a matter of debate, right? And the big issue is sometimes, I think, a little bit lost on some people, especially third parties. You know, they might look at the name issue with a bit of a quizzical look. You know, I think that what we're really talking about with the Republic of Macedonia is the ability for the Macedonians as a nation to have what they call a matična država, right, like a nation state, right? So the Greece is it's perfectly okay for Greece to have a nation state. It's perfectly okay for the Bulgarians and the Albanians to have a nation state. Actually, two, it seems. The Serbs eventually ended up with one as well, right? But for some reason, the West has decided that the Macedonians shouldn't have one. And I think that the changing of the name is about taking away the essential Macedonian character of the Republic of Macedonia and making it more a kind of anonymous, territory with which doesn't have that as its defining principle, right? And I think that that's what Greece ultimately wanted to achieve.
Yeah, they wanted to achieve a nation with no Macedonians, so that the real Macedonia could be that part that they occupy.
And the
And that's
proof of
always,
that,
sorry?
yeah, I was going to say that is that the relationships with Yugoslavia were generally positive.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah, 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 yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
Yugoslavia was this multi-ethnic state that Athens was okay with. You know, they even though there was a Macedonian republic, I don't know, it had the word socialist in front of it, and so when that word socialist was removed, Republic of Macedonia was all that was left, and then they had a problem, right? And they would often use arguments of the kind of like, we need a name that differentiates the Republic of Macedonia from our region of Macedonia, right? And that was always there. It was Republic of, right? The Republic of part always differentiated it, you know. But that wasn't actually their concern, because there was no concern in terms of an invasion from Skopje. You know, that was never an option. You know, it was completely complete lunacy, right? The issue with Greece and the threat to Greece has always had to do with its own internal conflicts, the issues it has domestically with large restive minorities that it doesn't recognize.
Hmm. Well,
You know,
one
I
thing you
mean,
can say about Macedonia, though, Mark, is we've had in 29 years an assassination attempt, an accidental death of a president. We've had
yeah,
an embargo. We've had 2 name changes. We've had, is it 3 or 4 different accords and agreements?
yeah.
And
Let's talk about that.
we've also had
Mm-hmm.
a lot of migration out, a lot of people fleeing because
Oh,
our economy never got a chance to grow. First, it was ripped off
absolutely.
by our own people, and secondly, it was
Mm-hmm.
placed under that stress. So
Mm-hmm.
there's someone we haven't spoken about is our political parties. We've
Mm.
kind of implied and inferred about the first ones, Gligorov and Crvenkovski, but we also
Mm.
had a conservative party. You know, we had a party whose leader toured the world here, the Macedonian communities, and was feted as the Voivoda.
Mm.
I don't know if you remember that.
Of course.
The Voivoda, who then turned out to stab us in the back. So while there's one group of the people in Macedonia accuse SDS of being communari and consider themselves as patriots because they call themselves, or part of the name of their party is VMRO, their policies, they haven't been any different either, have they?
Yeah, and if you see other states in Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall, the former communists or former socialists were often the ones who took charge immediately after independence, and Macedonia was no different. The SDSM, Social Democrat Party, every single one of them was, it seems, was a member of the former Yugoslav Socialist Party.
Yep.
So the American and Northern European interests have a history of working closely with people in these new republics who they otherwise were seen as opponents. You know, just a few years earlier, the Vomero de Pomone has always you know, framed itself as the conservative option, and as a party that that pushes a more Macedonian national idea, and it does so in terms of a lot of symbolic efforts. But you know, as we see over time, the trajectory of the country seems to still keep going into the direction that Greece wants it to go. So if you go past the interim accord, 1995, this is about 4 years after independence was declared. Here you have a new, where the post-interim accord period, where there's a bit of stabilization based on the fact that the country is finally in the United Nations, I suppose. But there was the stability was very short-lived. I mean, what happened in the Branko-Crvenkovsky years after Gligorov had left power was the same pattern that you're probably familiar with as an observer of former Eastern European communist states, where large factories, real estate, other kinds of assets belonging to these countries were sold off at a pittance, and oftentimes with the implication that a large sum of money went into the pockets of the people doing the selling. So I think that was what created the economic warfare, or continued the economic warfare, even though the embargo had been lifted. So the embargo had been lifted, the war in Bosnia had settled down, and then as soon as those economic pressures were relieved, then a whole bunch of new economic pressures were imposed, which were the various members of the SDSM and their partners who were selling off those assets and creating unseen poverty, and then that kind of moves us closer towards the next era, which I would argue starts in 1999. I mean, it might be considered a little odd because 1999 was the year of the invasion of Kosovo and the annexation of Kosovo, which happens in a foreign country. But I do think that it was extremely important for Macedonia, and it had a huge effect on the Macedonian future. You could argue that the effect of the invasion of Kosovo went far beyond Macedonia and was regional or even global, in the sense that it was an opportunity for payback. The Americans had felt that they had sort of been outsmarted a little bit at the Dayton Accords. They weren't happy with the way that the Bosnian War ended in terms of where the Serbs had it in a place, and it looked like a kind of revenge operation where they were basically, 4 years later, were like, well, we're going to show you, and that's essentially what they did. So, it created a level of violence that hadn't been seen in that region for decades, which was sending a strong message to countries like Macedonia right next door, who have a large Albanian minority, basically saying, if you don't play our game, then this is what's going to happen to you next. And I think that is the the big stick diplomacy.
And in fact, it did. And watching the news with my family in those days, my father always used to remark, he'd say, a ragtag army, a partisan army, they look like a very well dressed, very well armed professional army when he was talking about the Uchuka terrorists.
Trained by Blackwater.
So that's, we've had a change of governments, but we've always had one constant, and that there's always been, with whatever Macedonian party was in government, an Albanian party in government.
Absolutely, from the very beginning.
Usually, like they were the jockey riding the horse rather than the other way around.
And yeah, for sure. And the Albanian parties have always held a kingmaker position. Back in those earlier days, it was Arben Jafari's DPA, but I think that as time went on, the different players changed, but the principle remained the same, which was that via Albanian minority rights, in quotation marks, that was one of the ways that Western powers exerted their influence. 1999 was a very gruesome event. A lot of people died. All of Serbia was bombed in a way that was quite indiscriminate. They were bombing hospitals and schools and things like that. It wasn't that so-called surgical strike stuff you hear on CNN. It was more of a brutal bomb than people admit. And so what message do you think the Macedonians get? The very first thing that happens in 1999, which affects Macedonia obviously, is an enormous number of Kosovar refugees which come over the border, a huge number. It was something, I don't recall the exact figure, but I think it was in excess of 400,000. So for a country of 2 million, you can imagine, what that's like. So massive camps and a huge and very generous effort on Macedonia to take in refugees, some of which never left, or some of which ended up getting Macedonian documents.
With ulterior motives. It must be pointed out, with ulterior motives. Didn't just
later
come over,
living in Kosovo.
They didn't come over to help Macedonia, and they came to help destroy Macedonia.
Some people.
That has to be admitted. We can't keep pretending that somehow it's a struggle for Albanian human rights. I don't think there's any constitution in the world that is as generous to minorities as the Macedonian. And I, not being that well conversant with it, that was pointed out to me by my friend, who is the president of the Roma Association here. And he said, where in the world is another place where there is a Roma minister,
right,
where there is a Roma radio, television, theatre, where the language is recognized. So other minorities in Macedonia seem to get it, but the Albanian minority, who have got arguably the best minority rights of anyone, certainly in the Western world, that's not enough. Their next plan is to cut that chunk off. It's always been there. I think that plan goes back to the Second World War, doesn't it?
Yes, and the Albanians have been used as a tool of imperialism for a long, long time. In the Ottoman era, they were used by Istanbul as well. In World War II, you have the SS Skanderbeg division, which was the so-called Balisti, which were aligned with Adolf Hitler.
Who staged great villages.
Well, exactly, and so that role has never been lost on the Macedonians. In 1999, there was this very loud message from the West that not only are we going to punish the Serbs in this way and chop a piece of their country away, but we're also going to send a message to all the other regional powers and say, you're next. And I think that that's essentially the message that was received, and it has a big effect on Macedonian politics to today, because what happened in 1999 is they achieved their goal. Kosovo created this sort of quasi-independence, which is still being disputed, but they achieved their goal. They have this army, ragtag or not, which is there, ready, armed, ready to go. And in a matter of a couple of years, in 2001, Macedonia was invaded by a Uchaka that had a slightly different name, but which had exactly the same types of goals, which was the annexation of territory. And that was made very clear by Ali Ahmeti, at the beginning of the war. That war is the war that the U.S. State Department and other observers loves to ignore had even happened. Every time I hear someone refer to the end of that conflict, they'll say, they'll congratulate themselves for how they helped Macedonia avoid a war in 2001, and they'll use the word avoid as if it hadn't happened. Meanwhile, I was here in 2001, and I remember it very clearly. It actually did happen. The country was invaded. The Ottoman faced a number of battles. Each single one of them they won. There were a number of terrorist attacks and quite a lot of victims, hundreds of victims. But the war was being contained, and the culmination of that war was the Battle of Arachinovo, which a lot of people have never even heard of, especially in the younger generation. The Battle of Arachinovo is a predominantly Albanian town in the vicinity of Skopje, and it was a place where the UÇK or ONA or whatever they called themselves had been hiding out, and the government had created essentially a siege and had started bombing it with Ukrainian-made Tupolev, flying tanks that they had ordered against NATO's wishes, which is a key issue, because if there's one thing that NATO doesn't like, is they don't like when you buy military hardware from someone that's not from them.
They want you to spend your dollars with the Americans.
Yeah,
That's
I mean
the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, so the the Arachino situation involved the president of the country at the time agreeing to take all of the fighters that were pinned down there, put them on air-conditioned buses with their weapons, and send them on their merry way up to Kumanovo way, without the general understanding is that they were told to do that by the Western forces, and that they were going to be bombed the same way that Serbia was bombed. Who you want to believe is up to you, but certainly the something like Arachinovo has never happened, in my opinion. I can't think of a situation where there was that kind of bald-faced capitulation in modern history. And the direct result of Arachinovo was that the war came to an end with the Crete Framework Agreement, which is another deeply flawed document, which again got consensus from all of the so-called left-wing and so-called right-wing parties, and was written in English, and then translated into the languages that were eventually used. So the Ohrid Framework Agreement, again, what did it do? It in terms of concessions on the side of the UÇK, agreed to stop being terrorists. I mean, being a terrorist is illegal already. Here that's not much of a concession. They in return got a whole wealth of rewards for their violence, and that's the message, the strong message that was sent, was that if you are violent, then you would be rewarded. And the rewards involved things like, if a region reached 20% of one particular minority, that minority's language would then become official in the local area. It involved a number of Badinter majority issues, and quotas, ethnic quotas for the police force and for the judiciary, and rewarded the UÇK with real political power that they took full advantage of. So that was again another great capitulation that Macedonia has never really recovered from. I think the more important issue possibly is the other great agreement which happened at that time, which was the first of the amnesty laws. The amnesty laws essentially gave everyone involved in the murder and mayhem a free pass. They were the entire UÇK and other members of the Arma that were involved in the war were given blanket immunity from any kinds of prosecution. And not only that, but the key leaders of the UÇK, like Ali Ahmeti, like Jaferi, were also rewarded through the political process and started becoming ministers. And they started to become wealthy. They got on the gravy train as well. And 2002, we have the first census that took place after the war, and that was the last census. That was the last census that Macedonia has had. A very questionable census, a census with great question marks around it in terms of its accuracy and its legitimacy. And the Macedonian constitution requires a census to happen every 10 years, and they just skipped that, because that's the respect for rule of law that this system has. And from 2002 until today, the new incarnation of the UÇK, which formerly was known as ONA, became DUI, right? So this was a situation where these Albanian terrorists who are part of that that neo-Nazi tradition, going back to the ballisti, they essentially traded in their combat fatigues for fine Armani suits, and they became ministers, and they have been like concrete. They've been stuck in place since 2002 until today. They've been part of every single government in the Republic of Macedonia for 18 years. So that tells you something about the influence and where where America sees its bread being buttered. That amnesty law, I would argue, is possibly the most damaging of all of the agreements, because the amnesty law turns rule of law on its head. It basically says you can go and shoot someone in the face, and they're going to forgive you as long as it suits their political whims. And I think that there's a naivete in some circles about what that really means. When a country abdicates its requirement, to seek justice in those situations, then I think that the country loses its moral authority to exist in some ways. And I think that the amnesty law, again, was a law that ended up with bipartisan, multi-party support by MPs that seem to think that, yeah, this is something that we should be forgiving, and we're still paying the price for that today, obviously.
Well, we've actually probably should finish up tonight now, Mark. But
okay.
I think next one we should continue and talk about the savior of Macedonia, Mr. Gruevski, who fled, and a little bit more about the Prespa agreement and the upcoming elections. I think we've probably gone a bit longer than what we should have. Thanks everybody for watching, and all 150 of you. But we'll see you in a couple of days. And I want to thank our producer in Sydney, Mr. Z, Mr. Zoran. Thank you very much, brother. We'll see you all in a couple of days.